The first speaker will be Anthony Fontenot, who trained as an architect and is an associate professor of architecture at Woodbury University. He was awarded a 2009-2010 fellowship of the Society of Woodrow Wilson Scholars at Princeton University, and was also a Getty Scholar in 2010 and 2011. He is the author of numerous publications, including Gregory Ain and Cooperative Housing in a Time of Major Crisis, in Making a Case, which was published by Princeton Architectural Press in 2012.
So good evening, and I'd like to thank the Getty for inviting me to give this talk tonight. Looking forward to speaking and the discussion later. I should like to explain that while I am trained as an architect and an historian, I'm not involved in conservation. Nonetheless, I'm very excited to be here to present the work of Gregory Ain and to pose a series of questions about the role that conservation might play in the evolution of modern architecture in Los Angeles. A little background on Gregory Ain, who was born in 1908 in Pittsburgh, the son of a Russian-born socialist. His family moved to Los Angeles in 1911, and for a year they lived in the experimental forming collective Llano del Rios in the Antelope Valley, which undoubtedly helped shape his social vision of modern architecture. Ain attended UCLA and then USC, but he was discouraged by its training in Beaux-Arts classicism, and he did not complete the degree, claiming, and I quote, "It was an utter waste of time," end quote. After working with Richard Neutra from 1930 to 1935, Ain opened his own office in Los Angeles. With the rising rate of unemployment and homelessness in California during this period, Ain turned his attention to the desperate housing crisis and initiated what would prove to be a long-term commitment to, quote, social housing. The small private dwellings designed by Neutra in the 1930s served as an important precedent in his development of low-cost housing. A small-sized house could result in a low cost of construction, consequently making the house more affordable. Therefore, the need for a well-designed plan was all the more crucial. Throughout the 1930s, and this is one of his small houses, Ain experimented with developing highly efficient plans for small houses employing flexible spaces and built-in furniture. He also developed planning schemes whereby these small detached houses could be clustered to form a dense urban composition of multiple units on a single lot. By 1937, he achieved a remarkable resolution of this idea in the Dunsmuir Flats, one of his first projects to gain significant recognition. The project consisted of 4 two-story housing units staggered across a narrow and gently sloping single inside lot. Dispersed across the site, these, quote, private houses were attached but slightly shifted in plan, resulting in a balanced play between the subtle demarcation of the individual unit with its own private entrance and back garden and the overall collective of integrated farms. The project was praised by Architectural Record for its step-back planning strategy that allowed Ain to satisfy a rigorous set of demands, including, I quote, "a complete home for 4 small families, each with a private patio, cross-ventilation, and sunlight in all rooms, and as much privacy for each one of the units as is usually obtained in detached single-family dwellings," end quote. Given that each unit was completed for approximately $3,500, the project established not only a paradigm for low-cost modern housing, but an urban model for organizing multiple houses on a single lot. I will quickly try to walk you through the project, and what's important at this point is to understand the basic kind of organization of the project, which moves from the walkway side on the northern side, which Ain used to establish a kind of private, in this northern zone, a kind of private zone of entry and moving towards the private house and then opening up to a more common or communal space in the backyard. We can see how he uses these kinds of ribbon windows to kind of offer a kind of maximum privacy that is established on the northern wall. What it also does is, in addition to providing extreme privacy for the living room, it provides these exceptional light coming from not only one, two, but sometimes three directions. Across this way, it then opened up into the kind of common garden that we see on the other side. So here, both the bedroom and the living room are stacked, and here we are seeing this kind of north light. I should also add that you'll see throughout the project, the built-in furniture, built again over 75 years ago, is all mostly completely intact throughout the entire house. But again, if we could understand the basic proposition that Ain was up to, the tower serves as a kind of subtle demarcation between the two units. Inside the tower, it also provides an opportunity for one of the bedrooms to stretch all the way into the garden, as well as for the kind of dining to be pushed out into the garden. So both functional and at the same time creating a kind of hierarchy of individual spaces. As in much of California architecture during this period, the relationship between the inside and the outside was crucial. The movement into the outside, this 4-foot zone that Ain constitutes, it exists in almost all of the housing projects, and we'll try to discuss why it seems so important. On the one hand, we see that it offers not only a kind of shading zone, but it's also a zone of kind of personal, a zone of personal expression. In this case, from the brise soleil to the type of material that's used, the type of interior characteristics that come spilling out onto the kind of public garden. And here again, yet a completely different material that's being used. One of the things I wanted to talk about was the way, while the building has more or less, as I said, remained intact, the one thing that has kind of changed over the years has been the exterior buildings. And here, this gate was added sometime in the 1980s. And what the gate did was it converted, in addition to the gate being added, at some point, these fence lines were added into the backyard, basically converting the property into a kind of privatized northern entry zone, as well as kind of segregating each building into a kind of privatized unit, which was quite different from Ain's kind of understanding, or at least the way in which he envisioned, or the intention by which that back garden was to be used as a more communal space. And here in this drawing, we see Ain's pretty explicit about using kind of landscape as a way of extending, just as that tower or L shape was meant to demarcate the kind of privacy. The subtle move from architecture to landscape suggested a division, but at the same time stayed away from any emphatic division. Therefore, the use of the back garden was understood more as a kind of communal space. So the point being that the one move, and currently sometimes in 2001, the previous owner that moved in began to have a discussion with the other people there, and they all had decided to start to remove the back fences, and by doing that, return not only the garden to a kind of more current state, but also spoke extensively about the kind of social or communal aspects. So I guess I leave with this project this notion of, if beyond the idea of the kind of finishes and details, there's a kind of larger kind of social intention behind how spaces are used. And to me, these are some of the questions I'd like to get into with some of these other projects. The second project that I will be talking about is Park Plan Homes in Altadena. On the verge of a housing explosion in California, as government policies privilege market-driven decentralization and suburban developments of single-family dwellings, Ain was well aware of the urban and regional implications. In an article published in February 1945, he wrote, "The problem is a problem in planning, which, if not well solved now by the architects, will be badly solved later by the jerry builders." He saw his role as an architect as one who was responsible for developing low-cost practical solutions to address a wide range of social and urban problems. From the design of the individual unit to the pattern formed by its repetition across the urban landscape, Ain considered the planning of new housing development as one of the most important challenges of the period. One of one of the ways that he went about trying to kind of convert the typical suburban lot, and here we'll see a couple of other examples later, is that he chose to orient all the houses on the horizontal, creating a kind of urban wall, which meant that the kind of setback on the property line was pushed to its minimal, which allowed a kind of, as we'll soon see, a kind of what I would call an urban wall, creating a radical division between the front and the backyard. And here we kind of see how this kind of idea is stretched across the entire street. The other thing that we see, which is similar to some of the other projects, is this kind of, that on the one hand, a kind of continuous form can be read, and at the same time, the individual unit. So this dichotomy between the individual and the collective seems to play itself out. In 1945, Ain wrote, "The long-awaited era of the post-war house is at hand, and millions with hopes based on widely publicized visions of the house of tomorrow will be disappointed. No miracle has made available to the average earner shimmering fabrics of plastics and electronics on a secluded acre of gently rolling woodland." Critical of the ideal house of tomorrow with its proliferation of technological gadgets, Ain's proposal offered a realistic and well-studied attempt to achieve efficiency and enjoyable homes within the framework of the existing building industry. What he and the landscape architect Garret Eckbo put forth as an alternative to the endless sprawl of the gently rolling hills, as Ain refers to, is a rather highly organized and planned environment. And here you see a kind of very elaborate planning scheme by Eckbo. Eckbo also developed a wide range of different plants and species that created a kind of great variety. So against the repetitive form of the individual houses, we find clusters of radical difference. In fact, we could even see in the upper elevation, whereas with the incline, the kind of vertical next to the horizontal. So there's a kind of play against the repetitive use of the same house over and over. The landscape was to be a radically different idea. And here again we see more and more of these kinds of highly specific kind of designs for the garden. In detail, I should like to bring your attention to these kinds of geometric patterns. Eckbo once said that he wanted to use plants the way the Cubists used paint. We know he was highly inspired by Kandinsky and other modern artists. You see these geometric patterns that kind of underlie the kind of organization of the planning schemes themselves, which is to say a highly organized kind of way of going about planning the landscape. In this scheme, I want to draw your attention to the various gardens as well as the various courtyards. In green, what you see is what I would call one of the islands along the street. In the purple is a kind of inner courtyard, and in the orange is a kind of entry garden. Now notice that the island sits right between the property lines, which is to say, he was interested in this idea of sharing between two. In fact, who owns this island is one question. And by both respecting the traditional property lines and at the same time offering a kind of subtle blurring of those lines was one of the keys to what he would call a social landscape, which inherently speaks about the idea of a kind of shared interest in the larger urban environment. In this diagram here, what you're seeing, everything hatched is what they would call the social landscape, offering over the front yard as well as the street and letting it extend to the other side of the street as something that they would give back as to give a specific identity to a kind of neighborhood and community. Everything beyond the house was seen as a kind of radical privatization of the backyard. So both by respecting the conventions of the private backyard, but by radicalizing the front yard and removing all the kind of traditional signs of individual demarcation, as in fences and hedges, etc., they were able to arrive at this idea. So here's a series of these images, how they play out today. And I'm going to try to quickly go through some of these for the sake of time. But again, it's interesting to think of how that original plan has been to some degree maintained and to some degree transformed. And again, in each of these, we're seeing two houses with, again, that common shared island. In place of a traditional kind of boundary between the two houses, what we see in the lower picture is actually the elevation. The retaining wall offers the kind of subtle demarcation of the property lines, and at the same time creating a kind of common space between the two neighboring houses. Let's keep going. We also see kind of radical reinventions of what the typical garage units were and how they're being employed or rethought today. But the entry courtyards that you saw in the diagram marked in brown, here you're starting to see how that works. So again, from all the way from the entry back to the street and across the street was a series of courtyards and gardens that were all considered part of this social landscape. And here, again, another image of that. Here's the inner courtyard that you're starting to see. And in all of these, you can kind of start to get a glimpse of how these projects from 45 are all being kind of renovated in various ways. Again, one of the inner courtyards. And on the interior of the houses, Ain developed a rather ingenious clear-story idea, again, as a means of bringing light and air through all the houses. Again, holding on to his criteria that all spaces should have light coming and air at least from two directions, if not more. We see the kind of dramatic kind of conditions, and I apologize for the quality of some of these images. Something happened as we uploaded them. In this case, we also see, if you remember the kind of interior cabinetry from the Dunsmuir, these have been completely restored by the resident here. And this is one of the houses that's probably been closest to a complete restoration. And again, just some of the images of how light and everyday uses in these spaces unfold. In many cases, the houses, of course, have been upgraded, and kitchens and bathrooms have been, the original furnishings have been replaced. But maybe more importantly, the basic organizational structure of, again, the kind of public front yard and the hyper-private backyard of radical expressions and different means come through. In this case, back to this clear story window, one of the residents frustrated with some of the technical problems. While the clear story has offered incredible variety of light conditions, it's also posed a kind of challenge for drain and other technical problems. In this case, one of the residents just simply put metal roofing over it and called it a day and moved on. And here we kind of see what that kind of condition's like. So as far as conservation questions, there's quite a bit of technical issues that still come up. In this case, you can see, given that there is no attic, the question of HVAC and where those HVAC lines should be run. Interesting enough, in this house, the inner court is still used as a kind of service court, which was its original mission for washing and planting herb gardens and so forth. Again, more examples of these kinds of HVAC challenges. The other example that we could quickly run through is, while some have refurbished the original windows, others have chosen to update these with new metal windows and double glazing, et cetera, which offers a kind of new system while at the same time trying to maintain some of the essential light qualities of the space. In 2003, the tract was designated as a point of historical significance in Altadena, and this has encouraged many residents to take a greater interest in updating the external appearance of the buildings and developing the streetscape to reflect the original intention. The next project I will talk about is Mar Vista Housing. And similar urban planning strategies that were initially developed in park plan homes were employed here as well. This was also designed in collaboration with Eckbo. And here you see an idealized plan of what was to happen, and the areas in black showing what actually did happen. By taking a standard architectural element, which was the house, and choosing to orient or rotate the orientation, Ain was able to kind of arrive at a full diversity of the way a kind of neighborhood could then kind of reveal its diversity as opposed to sameness. Again, learning in a sense from the park plan homes, he employs a radically different strategy, yet at the same time using the standardized house, he's able to come up with a variety of conditions in which it both engages the landscape and the street. The houses were highly compact and highly efficient. In this case, as well, all of them were 3-bedroom houses, and this 4-foot zone on the north here, as we'll see, has been a kind of interesting zone. As we saw in Dunsmuir, that zone is almost in all of his houses, and that's the one place where we've seen some of the greatest kind of transformations, where people inevitably want to push that kind of glass wall out to a limit to expand the interior. We'll see some of the examples of that. Another way to deal with the kind of serial repetition of the house was also to develop a kind of color scheme which they employed to create a whole range of variety. But maybe the most important thing was that with the kind of repetitive kind of standardized houses, they were to use a kind of landscape, again, Eckbo's radical diversity of landscape, to create kind of completely different conditions that would move through the entire neighborhood. And here we see the kind of planting scheme that was put forth. And again, all of the individual lines of demarcation where fences or hedges might once have been in a typical neighborhood were removed. And this starts to open up this notion, again, of a kind of public landscape. In the case of Mar Vista, everything in Hatching is, again, this idea that from the face of one street, from one house across the street to the face of the next, all of this was understood to be something that one gave back to the community, something that was given back to a kind of public, or at least a social space that's given back to the neighborhood. And here you start to see some of them in these kind of amazing alleyway, park-like environments that now define what Mar Vista is throughout the area. What's interesting to me, at least, is the way the kind of the relationship between the kind of landscape and the architectural elements create a kind of dramatic, kind of using everyday kind of common or even standardized parts can create quite a drama in the kind of the simplicity in which the juxtaposition of the kind of the garden and the house again in a kind of public way. So in conclusion, I would like to put forth this idea that a thorough understanding of the social and spatial principles of a design may prove to be as important, if not more so, to good conservation practices than the minute details of original finishes, colors, materials, and the specific species of plants. What is the ultimate goal of conservation? Should the design of environments of historical significance be understood as historically fixed and frozen in time, or as sites of dynamic, evolving processes of experimentation based on the established design principles, yet open to interpretation? Thank you.